here.
Excellent, thank you. And they put the slides already in the chat, but we will we'll share those out in the community space as well as in the with the email when we send it out too. So.
Look okay, everybody?
Looks great.
It's good.
Awesome. So yeah, thanks for having us, guys. My name's Jeff. I'm joined with Naat, my colleague. We're both instructional designers at CEDL. It's the Faculty Development Center at Cal State LA. I'd still say like we're a pretty small shop. Like we do instructional design, faculty development, and ed tech support all in one unit. I know like some campuses are starting to do that as well, or some campuses have always done it that way, but we've always had a lot of different responsibilities. And I guess just the last like 2 years, my role has increased to really focus on faculty development and develop some new programming for CEDL. So Naat and I have been busy with this for a good 2 years. Naat, you've been on it for like a good year, right? Yeah. So we're really happy to share the program with you. So just some essential like program stats. We'll get to in a second, but this really was a huge team effort. We were really lucky to work with 5 awesome faculty subject matter experts. Portia Jackson-Preston, who's now at Fullerton, but she was in our public health department. Marla Parker, political science. Ali Tayeb, one of our nursing faculty. Karen Wu from psychology. Carl Schottmiller from liberal studies. All made huge contributions to our program. So a lot of these folks were responsible for kind of collecting the subject matter for the modules that we'll take a look at in a second. And then we've got a pretty big facilitation team this semester because we have 67 people in the program currently. They started last week. And so we have 4 facilitators managing 67 folks. And then our design and development team, myself, Naat, and then Lauren Brady. Lauren actually moved back east, so we lost her a little while ago, but she's trying to get a job at University of Pittsburgh and going on to bigger and better things in the East Coast. So here's what the program looks like. But before that, like let's talk about inclusion. Like what is inclusive teaching? I'll let you read that for just a quick second. This is from American Association of Colleges and Universities, and we really like their definitions. And the website down there has even more. Their definition for diversity, their definition for equity, mindedness. So I'll be quiet and let you read that for just a quick second. And so the way that we're looking at this is, not only diversity of students, but also diversity of ideas. And this is kind of these are the subjects that we are looking at. We look at our first generation students, who are students with disabilities, our veterans, and then we also look at faculty's kind of implicit bias as well. So there's 7 modules. The program is about 14 weeks long. We have spring break in there, so it's really 13 weeks of content, but a 14-week period. We estimate that faculty probably spend between 4 and 5 hours a week working on the course. They're doing it as a cohort, so it's not like self-paced. There are a number of discussions that they're participating in. Mostly it's asynchronous activities. We do have one live Zoom meeting for a discussion technique called the fishbowl discussion. And like I said, there's 67 people in the cohort with us this semester.
Yeah, we in this process we had various prototypes, and then we just started having a regular kind of breakdown of each module, a set pattern for our faculty learners so that they know what to expect for each module. So we roughly said on getting started, activate prior knowledge, review material and connecting that to the previous knowledge, review, read, review, explore new information, and practice that information or apply that information to a scenario, for example. So that's typically a discussion. A plan to implement assignment where we ask faculty to examine their own practice with a worksheet, and then see how they can improve their practice. And we keep doing this, and Reflect is basically a way to share out their findings to the rest of the cohort. So we we have the same similar assignments each module, so that there's a plan developed, and also they used to select the plan to implement, and they can build on that each module. And the content of each module also allows for that, because some of the lessons learned from first gen learners can be applied to vets or the difficult discussions module. And so both in terms of content and in terms of this design, they kind of work together. And we spent a lot of time kind of trying to fine tune that, working with our SMEs.
And it was tricky when we wanted a kind of consistent module design experience, because this subject matter, inclusive teaching, was an in-person workshop series before the online version. And I think one of the challenges there was that each of the faculty leading each individual workshop kind of did their workshop in their own way. So as we moved it online, we wanted to ensure that each module, each faculty's subject matter was presented in the same way, just for, you know, a nice consistent user experience, learning experience from module to module, since they are doing it all in the 14-week period. So let's dig into some of the activities and assignments. You know, I was just telling Naat, like, I'm really proud of this work because we didn't really use anything expensive or specialized. We really just kind of used Canvas and then a bunch of other free tools. And I feel like that's what instructional designers do. Like, we're pretty scrappy, and I'm sure all of you are in the same boat. Like, you kind of have to use free tools that are out there, and you know, embedding stuff into Canvas to make it look, you know, really, really awesome. So let's take a look. We do quite a bit of embedding of outside services. So we have Qualtrics. You know, the modules all start with a knowledge survey where we ask the faculty to, you know, think about their current practice. And so, you know, these are the inclusive teaching practices, and their first exposure to them is in this knowledge survey. And so they're looking at this like, oh, you know, do I use simple student-friendly language in my syllabus? And they're making a determination like, you know, I often do this, sometimes I never do this. And so this generates some important information from us about the cohort to kind of see where they currently are or what their beliefs are about how inclusive they are. We also have a bunch of embedded interactions too.
Yeah, we experimented with different kinds of embedded interactions from H5P. We used them to make content pages interactive. For example, here we presented various strategies to help engage first-gen students, and then we challenged the faculty to choose one that they'll use in their course. And as you can see, there's some feedback there for each response. So this helps break up the visual organization of the page and also allows them to interact with it.
And of course, like, H5P is free. You know, like, I'm a little bit familiar with like SoftChalk, but you know, that requires a license, and then all of that content has to be in the SoftChalk ecosystem. You know, this is really cool because we can just still use Canvas pages, but, you know, still have some sort of, you know, quick check-in to check for understanding. And, you know, it's not really graded, it's just for their benefit.
Right.
That's it. Canvas discussions, you know, again, kind of the bread and butter for a lot of online courses, but, you know, we try to make them as engaging as possible for the faculty. You know, a lot of times I think, you know, when faculty do discussions with their students, they're disappointed because the students aren't as engaged, and it's partly because they're not framing it and not kind of laying out the expectations that they have of their students. So, you know, we got to kind of like, you know, model for them what we're looking for. So we start out with a purpose statement, the steps. There's a pretty, you know, in-your-face reminders area to let them know that we'll be using a rubric to adhere to the community agreement. Yeah, so I'm getting some questions about some of the CSS. So I'll just go back, I'm looking at the chat here. So with the Qualtrics survey, we didn't do anything fancy with that. It was just an iframe. So we were able to embed that the same way that we were able to embed the H5P. And the columns here, the side-by-side columns, I'll talk about in a little while. We're using Canvas's style guide, which uses Flexbox Grid. And I have some of the code snippets that I can share with you all. But that's what's allowing us to get these two things side by side. And then just some fancy CSS to put the border and then the little drop shadow. But yeah, all through just some CSS in Canvas. And then this is kind of like the signature assignment at the end of each module. Naat was talking about this earlier. This is the plan to implement, where they're revisiting those inclusive teaching practices, and what they're doing is they're kind of talking about whether or not they currently do it, and if not, then why not? What's the context? What's preventing them from doing that particular inclusive practice? So, for instance, like I'll have folks say something like, "Well, I'm teaching geology, and difficult discussions aren't a thing," you know, and so they'll type that up, they'll reflect on that, and then facilitators will give them feedback on that and challenge them a little bit to stretch their thinking of some of those inclusive teaching practices. All right, so how we present the content. Again, nothing fancy, nothing expensive, just, you know, just good Canvas course development.
Yeah, we try to break up the content, you know, have a beginning, middle, and end of a page. And so we had relatively shorter pages and with some compelling visuals. You know, it says Unsplash is a great resource. You're probably familiar with that, but it's a great resource, and we use that to depict locales, to depict interactions. We also use, you know, Flickr Creative Commons, Wikimedia Commons. Also, Smithsonian also has a new open access database of images. So we also added alt text to all these images as well. So we had to, it's the inclusive teaching program, so we had to do everything by the book.
How embarrassing. Right, there's some sort of issue. Like we encourage, you know, a lot of times, we were talking about this yesterday too, like Naat is in charge of the DOC program, which is our Designing Online Courses program. And we were saying, like, if faculty don't have any online teaching experience, like this, what I mean by that is like online learning experience as a student to inform their teaching of an online class. This is an online class basically, and it's a really great opportunity for them to experience being a student and to see, you know, what we think is a good course design. We're also using Canvas Studio. It's okay, you know, it's basically like a private YouTube inside of Canvas. You know, folks can upload their videos, embed those into Canvas. It has pretty good captioning. They claim it's about 85% accurate on the first rounds for the auto-generated, and then you can go in and you know, increase the accuracy. You know, there's other media platforms out there, but we just can't afford them. And we have Canvas Studio kind of as a leftover from when we were piloting it. So it's here, we are using it, and it's okay. It's a pretty good system. But again, just kind of using it to embed videos. And these were some videos of students talking about their disability or some of the challenges that they face in their learning. And these were all created by the Chancellor's Office, and we wanted to leverage them. You know, we're always telling faculty, like, don't reinvent the wheel, like use existing content, and that's what we did here.
Yeah, we were investigating different infographics kind of tools out there, and one thing that helped us actually is to find out which ones were ADA compliant and which ones we didn't have to do any additional work with. So we chose an infogram. It's relatively limited for a free license. You can make about 8 to 10, I think, but it was useful in our case. And there's definitely space there for alt text or descriptions for each item. So that was useful. So we recommend using infogram for these kind of projects.
And then some of the modules feature like a PowerPoint. So I found that the best way to kind of embed those was to put them in Google Drive and then embed them as a PDF, which kind of preserved some of our styling from a PowerPoint slide deck. The university decided to adopt some fonts, you know, kind of like a branding guide with fonts that aren't available in Google or aren't available on the web. So to kind of preserve that style, you know, we had to create PDFs to kind of preserve the aesthetics of the PowerPoint. So we were able to embed those, and folks are able to download those PDFs and retain a copy in case they want those for future reference. All right, so let's get into some technical stuff now. The UI and some CSS that we're using. Again, we didn't really, I'm not a developer. I don't really know that much about CSS. We've got Henry Acevedo, who might be on the call, who's our LMS administrator, who's really good with like Python. But you know, even he'll say like, I'm not a web developer. So like we basically kind of fumble our way through this and rely really heavily on the Canvas community to kind of share code snippets, and that's basically all this is. But I can just kind of show you what those look like in practice. The first one that I really like is the responsive design through Flexbox Grid. So what this is doing is allowing the web page to be squishy. So depending on the students, the faculty, any users, screen real estate, the design is going to respond to that. So the screenshot on the right side is, basically full page width, but then when they start to squish it down, maybe they are looking at it on their iPad, it's going to respond to that. And the icons in this case will kind of fall underneath each other. And we use this all throughout the program. This is what was allowing the reminder box to be next to the instructions for the discussion board. And I'll have to go back and show you the code snippet for this. It's really not that extensive. I'll bring that up later on. We're also using tabs, and this is stuff from the Canvas style guide. And I think I'll move this slide up in the next time I give this presentation, but disclaimer here is that they're going to get rid of the style guide that's allowing us to currently do this. They're coming up with their new style guide, Insta UI 2.0, and they really haven't figured out a way yet of being able to use the style guide through the text editor. So at some point, all of this will probably break and we will have to figure something out. It is possible to host your own CSS in the instance. And I guess, we'll have to make a determination whether or not that's something we decide to do. Take the CSS that Canvas used to host and then host it ourselves so that some of this continues to work. It's also possible to add your own. jQuery is an option for that, to be able to get tabs and accordions and some of the other stuff that can then be loaded into Canvas's CSS, and then it's loaded there at the instance level. But tabs are really great. It's a way to present a lot of information on a single page without it being kind of, what do we call it? The scroll of death, having a really, really long page of content that users might not ever scroll down to the bottom of. The tab is a great way to present some of that information. And I'm just looking at the comments here. New Rice enhancement editor. I don't know, I haven't played with the new rich content editor. It's in our beta instance. I don't know whether or not it will have support for some of these fancier, ways of structuring the page. It's something I'm really curious about. Yeah. So that's our tabs. We're also using, let's see what else we got here. The Canvas icons. This is actually one of my favorite things because, you can say use the reply button, but if you can actually show them the icon in the instructions, that's even better. This is actually the code snippet here. It's actually really, really simple. It's an A class and it has the icon name. And there's a web page that Canvas maintains that has all the icon names with the little symbol. And so this way, I can actually show them the 3 dots that they need to click on to show the rubric. And again, it's a small thing, but just helps folks, become accustomed to the user interface of Canvas. Something that's not lost on us is that faculty, this might be the very first time they're using Canvas as a student. Mm-hmm. They're accustomed to using it from the instructor side with edit mode turned on, but this may be the first time they're using it as a student. So they may not be familiar with those parts of the interface. Yeah, here's our disclaimer. And this is the website you can check out for more information on kind of the future of some of this CSS that we're using currently. Of course, they're not really telling us what that timeline is like. I think it's the tabs that a long time ago, like maybe a year or 2 years ago, they said they were going to deprecate, and it still works. So I don't really know what the timeline is like for the rest of this stuff to sunset. So, at some point it'll probably break, and that's how we'll know that it's no longer supported. Oh, another one is the redirect tool. Who uses that one? I think that's just like an awesome tool. Yeah. So you want some customization of the course menu, and for us here, it's the ability to put in an orientation and a get help page to have those show up. So when you go into settings, you go to the apps area, and you can add. It's called the course redirect, URL redirect. And it's one of the apps that's just there. It's this icon here. And again, it's really great. You can just want things like, I would just avoid cluttering up the course menu with every possible thing. It really should be for stuff that's like like must have, like super, super important stuff that the students need to have access to. But if you have a really long course menu, then it probably just is not as helpful anymore. Let me go back to here. There we go. So what I'd like to do now is we can poke around in the course if there's anything that you want to see. We're ready for your questions, and we can actually go into the live course too if there's anything you want to look at up more closely as well.
I have one question for you guys. So you said that this current cohort is 67 students?
Yep.
How many facilitators do you have in it?
We got 4 people, 4 facilitators.
Okay.
So it makes for groups of about 20 people. You know, again, this is the second week of the program. We started last week. And so some folks are still determining whether or not they can kind of like do it, you know, whether or not they can manage the workload. So
right.
we started with 77 and now we're down to 67, you know, people have withdrawn. And that happened last semester too. Folks are probably, you know, they're caught off guard by the workload of this, you know, really is a course. It's not like a self-paced thing with a PowerPoint that you look at and then take a quiz. You know, it's not like an HR training, you know, it really is a robust learning experience. So I think that catches some people off guard and, you know, they'll let us know if they don't want to continue, or they just kind of fade away too. We had folks who just don't participate, and after like week 4, I end up just deactivating them because, you know, our feeling is we don't really like people lurking in the course. We want people who are actively engaged, especially around this subject matter. It really needs to be people who are, you know, willing to continue to interact with their colleagues.
Yeah, makes sense.
I'm just looking at the chat here. Yeah, sure. So I'm going to jump into the course and let me turn on student view, then we can poke around a little bit. All right, so you see when in student view, got a much cleaner course nav. You know, again, folks start out with the orientation. And they're just, you know, at the beginning of the program, they're blasted with a bunch of messages from us, you know, telling them, hey, don't forget to do the orientation. You know, we host a live online meeting too to kind of convey some of this information. But here's our tabs. Let me zoom out a little bit. That's Marla and Octavio. Octavio is our Chief Diversity Officer, Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Again, they're kind of their intros. Again, nice cool tab structure here. The orientation basically acts as our syllabus. And I'll go back to modules here. And we're definitely using requirements and modules. So folks will see check marks so they can kind of keep track of what they've looked at, haven't looked at. For discussion boards, we have it set to when they contribute, they get a green check mark. They submit their assignment, they get a green check mark too. Looking at the chat here, so we got the student perspective. How do I measure success? So really that's going to be in that plan to implement. Let me show you one so you can kind of get an idea of what that looks like. So at the very end of each module, this is the signature assignment, the plan to implement new teaching practices. And you saw this part here, but the actual worksheet itself looks like this. No, go away, Grammarly. So they get to see those inclusive teaching practices again, but then they're able to go in and put in, indicate whether or not they currently do it, always, sometimes never, and they're able to provide an explanation as well as to what kind of unpacking what they believe, whether or not they're kind of adhering to that teaching practice. So in this document is what I, you know, kind of will kind of see whether or not that message of inclusivity is kind of registered with that person. You know, a lot of times it gives us an opportunity to, you know, again, challenge the faculty member to say, you know, have you thought about it this way? And I don't like to, you know, it's kind of like, I'm just trying to teach chemistry. Like that's how I'll know that someone is kind of being a little bit resistant, if they kind of say things that make me feel like their subject matter just isn't, it's not an issue because their subject matter is like sterile, like it's just science. And so it can't possibly be an issue for diversity and inclusion. And so again, as facilitators, we gently push back and get them to rethink that perspective and challenge them a little bit to make their teaching practice a little bit more inclusive. Let me see the chat here some more. Do you want to talk about self-paced? That was one of the chat things here.
Self-paced, we do have quizzes in this, so they do get some, and they cover definitions, they cover trends, they cover practices. We even have a discussion question, a quiz question where they have to pick a strategy. We feel that's useful, but then we do want to foster the interaction, like the discussion is very important, because we ask them to examine their own perspective, how that came about through their experience in the classroom, and then how that affects their own practice, for example. And then we have other activities where they take a test, for example, on their biases, and then they have to kind of report out, and there's a discussion, difficult discussion about that. So we feel that even though it's an online course, we don't want to be like a shield, you know, like online a shield. Basically, it's just a way to allow them to examine the material, learn the material, but then also interact with us in a real environment about how inclusive teaching would affect their practice, and it does affect their practice. So I would say overall self-paced can be helpful, and we can have some of this as a self-paced, but a lot of the work is with them kind of going through that plan to implement for each of these modules and determining, okay, this is what I'm doing, this is not what I'm doing, and getting feedback from one of us. And the facilitators are experts in this, like Carl Sharp-Miller, he is an expert in the disability studies. And Catherine Harris is our director, and she's also helping extensively with the teaching philosophy for each of these participants. So I think interaction is critical to do this in the way we're doing it.
Yeah, and Naat actually took the first generation student module and turned it into a self-paced course for another workshop program we have. It's called the Teaching Project. And you know, that I think works and functions just fine. But your point about like getting feedback, like if people are kind of taking this whenever they want, then it means that we have to give feedback whenever they submit the assignment. Having it cohorted, you know, we can set aside time to grade and give feedback to the 20 people that we're working with. With self-paced, that makes it a little less predictable to be able to find out, like, okay, will we have an influx of people suddenly taking the self-paced course, and does that mean that my schedule might be, you know, turned upside down because I have to give feedback to a bunch of people? With this, you know, we know when the program starts, we know when the program ends, and we know when, you know, big assignments are being turned in. So it helps the facilitators kind of plan out their workflow a little bit better.
And there's a benefit for the participants too, being cohorted. They go through the same process together. They can see connections together between each of the plans implements. So it's very useful.
And they're, you know, they could be meeting people from, I mean, they are meeting people from other departments.
Right.
And I think one of the big ahas that they have is like, you know, oh, you struggle with the same issue? You know, the teaching is teaching, and good learning or good effective teaching is pretty agnostic to subject matter. I think that's one of the big aha moments that a lot of folks have, is hearing that it's not just accounting, or it's not just econ that's struggling with some sort of particular thing. Yeah, so just another question from Megan. Yeah, we, the facilitators, the 4 facilitators hang out with the group for the entire 14 weeks. The faculty subject matter experts, those are our, let me go back to citation here. These folks here helped create the modules And Marla actually happens to be one of our facilitators this semester. So she's hanging on to facilitate a group of about 20 faculty. And then Catherine, myself, and Carl, we also have a group as well. But they're all in this course together. We're using sections and groups in Canvas to kind of keep people organized and to allow us to send targeted messaging just to our group. But yeah, all 67 people are in this course, and the facilitators work with them for the entirety of it.
So when it comes to doing the feedback, do you stick with just the same, or do you share the responsibility of the feedback?
So like if I'm facilitating my group, I'm giving them feedback on all of their plan to implement assignments.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so like go ahead, sorry.
So you're basically managing the same 20 through the whole semester.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then facilitators are checking in constantly. You know, we've got a Dropbox paper doc where we're keeping track of who's up to send an announcement to the group. We have a place to kind of record highlights from discussions because we like to share that out in the weekly announcements. So that way we can, that way there's some insight that's, you know, being provided to the other groups.
Right, so there's that cross connection that's happening between everybody. Okay.
Exactly.
I gotcha. Thank you.
And I'm seeing another question from Whitney. Yeah, so for our faculty subject matter experts, we're provided a stipend. That was arranged through with Catherine, our senior director, and Carl, who's our current faculty fellow, is our faculty fellow for accessibility, but he's also on board for facilitating one of the groups for inclusive too. So he's with us right now. I just remembered Marla is too as well. She's one of our current faculty fellow as well, and she is receiving a stipend to help facilitate. Yeah. And whether or not it's considered for service, I know for, I'm certain that Catherine writes letters for folks' files, so that's part of it as well for RTP. Yeah, you're welcome. So thanks for having us all, everybody. Happy to continue to poke around or address additional questions, but yeah, that is our inclusive teaching program.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing.
You're welcome.
And I'm sorry if you already answered this question, but what do the participants, or do they receive anything at the completion of the program?
Okay.
That's good.
So we wanted to save some of this for the I keep saying Canvas CIG. This is the Canvas CIG, but for the ID CIG. So we have a couple of slides hidden there, but I'll just quickly show you these real fast. We give them a certificate. It's great for their file. But something we're also experimenting with is this action plan as well. So in the plan to implements, the facilitators keep track of which teaching practices they select to implement. And we keep track of this in a spreadsheet. And at the end of the program, we end up creating this action plan for them. So these are the same practices that they committed to. And we print this out and give it to them when we provide the certificate. That way, you know, again, we also kind of make a suggestion, like put this in your workspace, you know, put it right next to your computer, somewhere where you can see it, where students might see it during office hours. And the idea is to just make your inclusive teaching transparent, you know, as a constant daily reminder to you, but also to your colleague that you might share an office with, to just kind of change some of the vocabulary, some of the language around inclusion, and to really just kind of show concrete examples of it. You know, so this again, it's a daily reminder in their workspace of what inclusive teaching means. And yeah, again, the action plan, once they finish, we give them a copy of this. And I just saw one other question too, in terms of like sharing the curriculum materials. You know, again, that's probably like a conversation to have with Catherine, you know, our senior director. I think, you know, we would like to open the program up to other folks. I just don't know when we would do that. That's something that I know Catherine and maybe Emily at the Chancellor's office are kind of discussing. So stay tuned is kind of what I can say right now. But yeah, we're happy to have other folks from other campuses join. We got to get the timing right for that. And again, it's kind of something that's above my pay grade as well to have those discussions.
Do you guys have it currently shared, or any plans of sharing like the curriculum in an adaptable format, like out to Commons or something for others to import and adapt?
It's a possibility. I think like maybe the plan to implement worksheet could be an example of that. Like the inclusive teaching practices that are featured on the worksheet might change, you know, depending on the campus context. You know, that's something that we're very cautious about too, is the institutional context. Like your student body is going to be very different depending on which Cal State we're talking about. And so for us here, you know, first generation students is predominantly Latinx students. You know, we have the highest number of first generation students of any four-year state comprehensive university. So again, some of the modules focus a little more heavily on certain student groups, but that's not to say that that's unimportant or less important at another campus. So I think that's part of our feeling is if we like provide the program to other campuses, like would they have to be able to like customize it for that particular student group that's at that university? So that's part of the discussion around like how portable it is, how portable the program is. Does it have to be customized to the institution?
Oh, hey. Yes, hang on, let me mute myself.
Open mic.
All right. Looks like we had one other question from Sylvia. Asked if you use the overall course design as a model for other trainings in different subjects or gone back and redesigned previous trainings based on this.
What do you think?
I think, yeah, the use of the patterns, the use of the course design, because we did lots of prototyping of this and pretty open feedback about this with many members of our team here. So I think all those, all that feedback and even criticism in some cases was taken into consideration in other programs. For example, allowing white space, shorter pages, having a set pattern for each module, and we also incorporated feedback from faculty in a previous cohort. So I would say, yeah, I mean, we have been incorporating the feedback and the results of this in other programs. And when, for example, in just that self-paced, we kind of furthered some of these points that we got in that, and in the designing online courses too, that has 2 online workshops, and we did incorporate some of that feedback into that program. So it's a good experience to develop your internal online offerings, because it allows you to share like best practices and also for your faculty to see what it looks like in a real course. So the answer is yeah.
So I'm going to give up the screen share here. Again, thanks everyone for listening. Again, happy to share more with anybody offline. Again, thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for sharing. That was lots of ideas, and I know a lot of excitement about what you guys are doing. And I think there's a lot of people who'd like to get the chance to use some of it or take a look at it. So I know that's a conversation. Was there, I mean, we've got this recorded. Were there any updates or announcements anyone in the group needed to make? I saw a couple things posted earlier. I just wasn't sure if there was anything anyone wanted to toss out or ask. Okay. I think then that if there's nothing else to discuss, we will close down early and we'll get everything out in the Canvas space. I mean, Michael will, he's been great about getting that stuff out. And then we'll follow up with the email and the recording as well. So
yeah, we'll make sure you guys have links to everything. So thank you everybody for coming. And
thank you, yeah.
You know, Naat and Jeff, thank you guys so much for sharing all this content with us.
It's great. Have a good February. We'll see you everybody in March.
Thanks, y'all. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.